All the characters in the story are over 18 years old. The creaking of the floorboards under my father's feet always got on my nerves. The sound, so familiar in a city apartment, seemed alien here in my grandmother's house, breaking the tinkling summer silence. I was sitting on the veranda, wrapped in a plaid despite the warm July night. A book lay open in front of me, but I wasn't reading. I was listening. To the creaking of the floorboards, to the grasshoppers chirping in the tall grass, to the rustling of the leaves of the old linden tree by the porch, and to my own restless breathing. The creaking was getting closer. He appeared in the doorway as if he had grown out of the twilight, illuminated by the dim light of the living room lamp. Tall, broad-shouldered, with strands of gray in his dark hair. My father. He held 2 mugs of steaming tea in his hands. He held one out to me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and husky, not like his usual voice. In the city he always spoke sharply, curtly, always in a hurry. Here, in the village, it was as if he had thrown off the bustle of the city, along with his jacket and tie. "Just reading," I mumbled, taking the mug. The scent of mint and molasses enveloped me, bringing with it a strange, pinched feeling, an uneasy feeling of foreboding. My father sat down next to me, too close, it seemed to me. The warmth of his body literally burned my skin, even through the wicker chair. I recoiled involuntarily. "It's a beautiful night," he said, looking up at the starry sky. I looked up. The myriad stars were scattered across the dark blue velvet of the sky like diamonds scattered across black silk. Yes, the night was indeed beautiful. But I couldn't savor the beauty. I was embarrassed by my father's proximity. His presence seemed too tangible. "Mm-hmm," I answered, trying not to look at him. His proximity made me uncomfortable. This wasn't the father I knew. Urban, always busy with work, he was always reserved and short-tempered. He rarely hugged me, even more rarely spoke affectionate words to me. Here, in the village, it was as if he'd dropped his mask and turned into a stranger. A man I didn't know and who frightened me. "Alina," he began, hesitating. His voice trembled. He turned to me, and I met his gaze for the first time that evening. There was something incomprehensible in his eyes. Anxiety, desire, guilt. I couldn't make it out. I wanted to... At that moment, the gate slammed shut. Grandmother had returned from her evening walk. My father stopped talking abruptly, turned away, pretending to gaze at the starry sky. The tension in the air dissipated like smoke. I exhaled, feeling my heart slowly calm down. But a strange sense of unease lingered, as if something important, something inevitable, had just happened, but remained unspoken, hidden behind a facade of ordinariness. And that something had to do with my father. I knew it. That summer evening was the beginning of something new, strange and frightening, something that would forever change my relationship with my father and with myself. My relationship with my father had always been complicated. He worked long hours, traveling on business trips, and our communication was limited to short phone calls and casual dinner conversation. I couldn't say he didn't love me. Rather, he just didn't know how to show his feelings. Mom, on the other hand, was the epitome of warmth and caring. She filled all the voids, smoothed out the sharp edges, tried to create the illusion of a full-fledged, happy family. But I always felt this invisible wall between me and my father. A wall of silence, of restraint, of unspoken words. The decision to spend the summer at my grandmother's was spontaneous. Mom went to a conference, and I, tired of the bustle of the city, dreamed of peace and quiet. My grandmother's house, old, wooden, with a cherry orchard and the smell of freshly baked bread, had always been a place where I felt safe. My father was against it at first. He had his own plans for the summer, but then, out of the blue, he changed his mind. He said he was tired too and wanted to rest in the village. I was glad. It seemed to me that this vacation could bring us closer together, that we could finally communicate properly, get to know each other better. But I was wrong. The first few days were quiet. We walked in the woods, swam in the river, helped my grandmother with chores. Father was different, relaxed, smiling, attentive. He often joked, told stories from his childhood, was interested in my affairs. I liked that kind of father, but at the same time, I could feel the tension building. His glances were becoming too long, his touches too frequent. It was as if he were looking for an excuse to touch me, to put his arm around me, to fix a strand of hair out of my braid. And there was something wrong about those gestures. One evening we sat on the veranda and watched the sunset. Father was talking about his work. Suddenly he stopped halfway through and looked at me. His gaze was filled with such longing, such pain, that it took my breath away. "Alina," he said quietly, "you look so much like your mother." I smiled. I had been told that often, but there was something else in his words, something that made me flinch. He reached out and stroked my cheek. The touch was so gentle, so intimate, that I froze, unable to move. At that moment, I realized that something had irrevocably changed, that there was an invisible line between us that we could never cross. Grandma's house breathed peace and history. The old photographs on the walls, the embroidered tablecloths, the smell of dried herbs and apples, all of it reminded me of the simple but happy childhood I had spent here every summer. Until this year, my father had come rarely, excusing himself with work. His presence this time seemed to me something unusual, a sign. I even thought that he might have decided to mend our relationship, and that thought warmed my soul. For the first few days, I tried to ignore my father's strange looks, his unexpected touches. I wrote it all off as fatigue, an unusual environment for him. We spent a lot of time together, walking in the forest, picking mushrooms and berries, swimming in the river. He taught me how to fish, told me about different kinds of trees, about the habits of forest animals. I was discovering a new father whom I had not known before. He was an interesting conversationalist, an attentive listener, caring, a man. It was then that I first thought of him, not as a father, but as a man. The thought shocked me, and I tried to banish it, but it came back again and again. I remember one incident particularly vividly. We were coming back from the river. I was walking ahead, barefoot, carrying a basket of towels. Suddenly I tripped on a protruding tree root and almost fell. My father grabbed my hand and pulled me to him. I felt the warmth of his body, heard his rapid breathing. He didn't let go of me for longer than it took to regain my balance. His arm around my waist and his gaze. It was a gaze I would never forget. There was so much tenderness in it, so much desire. I pulled out of his embrace, confused and frightened. He, too, seemed to wake up, apologized, and turned away. But that moment hung between us, invisible but palpable, like an electric shock. After that incident, everything changed. I began to avoid my father, afraid to be alone with him. His presence began to suffocate me. I kept catching his gaze, feeling his proximity, and I felt hot and cold. I didn't know what was happening. I felt like I was going crazy. I was angry at my father, at myself, at this strange situation I was in. And at the same time, I wanted him. I wanted his touch, his attention. The thought was disgusting and yet sweetly intoxicating. I was confused, frightened, and aroused. And this mixture of contradictory feelings was tearing me apart. The hot July day stretched on endlessly. The air, rich with the scent of blooming roses and jasmine, seemed thick and thick, like molasses. I wandered through the garden, trying to find some privacy, some coolness in the shade of the old apple trees. But even here, in the nooks and crannies of the garden, I was haunted by the sensation of his presence. It was as if invisible threads tied us together, tightening with every breath. My thoughts were jumbled, images swarming over each other like a kaleidoscope. My father, his hands, his gaze, the occasional touch of his fingers on my skin. I closed my eyes, trying to banish the images, to drown out the throbbing blood in my temples. But they came back again and again, more vivid, more intrusive. I heard his footsteps from a distance. The crunch of gravel beneath his feet was like thunder in the heat of the day. I froze with my back against the trunk of an old apple tree, as if trying to merge with it, to become invisible. But he found me. He always found me. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. His voice, usually steady and calm, sounded hoarse now, with a slight tremor. I opened my eyes. He was standing very close, too close, so close that I could feel the warmth of his body, hear the beat of his heart. And that rhythm, so close to my own, was hypnotizing, will-less. "Nothing," I whispered, unable to look away from him. My lips were dry, my tongue stuck to my palate. "Don't lie," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can see that you're in pain, just as I am." He reached out and touched my cheek. I flinched, but I didn't pull away. On the contrary, I wanted to snuggle into his hand, to soak up his warmth. His fingers caressed my skin like a flame, burning and drawing me in at the same time. There was the same longing in his eyes, the same pain I'd seen before, and also desire, an unconcealed burning desire that was reflected in my eyes. Eyes, too. I don't know what's wrong with me," I whispered, feeling tears come to my throat. Tears of embarrassment, fear, and arousal. "I know," he said, his voice shaking. "I know, too. I feel the same way." He pulled me to him and kissed me. It wasn't a fatherly kiss. It was the kiss of a man hungry for a woman, longing for meat. I responded to the kiss as if hypnotized, intoxicated by his closeness, by his scent. His hands slid under my blouse, caressing my breasts. I moaned, feeling a wave of desire wash over me, erasing all doubt, all fear. We fell to the grass without breaking the kiss. His hands roamed my body, igniting a fire in me I'd never known before. A fire of passion, a fire of desire. I gave myself to him without resistance, like a moth to a flame, knowing it would be my undoing, but unable to resist the urge. At that moment, I didn't think about consequences, about morality, about the fact that he was my father. I thought only of him, of his touch, of the pleasure he gave me. I was drunk on his closeness, on his caresses, on the feeling he awakened in me. It was something new, incomprehensible, forbidden, and incredibly beautiful. So beautiful that I was ready to forget everything in the world. It was our first time, the first step into an abyss from which we could never get out. We had crossed a line from which there was no return. In the days that followed, our meetings became regular. We sought solitude in the garden, in the woods, in the attic of the old house. We became agile and silent, like wild animals hiding from prying eyes. Each time was like the first, passionate, tender, full of pain and pleasure. We were like two lost travelers who found each other in the vast desert. We clung to each other like drowning men, afraid to let go, afraid to be alone, afraid of losing the magic that was between us. We knew it was wrong, that it was a sin, but we couldn't stop. We were drawn to each other with an irresistible force, like a magnet. We were bound by an invisible thread, a thread of forbidden love that grew tighter and tighter, threatening to strangle us both. But we were ready to suffocate in that embrace, just so we wouldn't part. The August night was cool, contrasting with the stifling heat of the previous day. Myriads of stars twinkled in the dark sky like scattered diamonds. We sat on the bank of the river, embraced, and were silent. The river murmured softly, as if trying to drown out the tension that hung in the air. It was not that light, intoxicating atmosphere of the first meetings, full of passion and forbidden pleasure. It was something heavy, pressurizing, like a pre-threatening stuffiness. We both felt that our secret, our forbidden love had gone too far, and that we had to do something about it. "We need to stop," I said without looking at him. My voice trembled, betraying my fear and confusion. He was silent. I could feel his body tense, his arm around my shoulders tightening convulsively. He didn't want to let me go, and I didn't want to either. I can't," he whispered finally. His voice was hoarse, full of pain. "I can't imagine life without you. You've become everything to me." "But that's not right," I said, struggling to hold back tears. Tears of despair, of hopelessness. We're We're family. We can't. What difference does it make? He shrieked, turning sharply toward me. There was pain and despair in his eyes, the desperation of a man on the edge of a precipice. Can't you feel what's between us? It's not just infatuation. It's love. I love you, Aliena. No, I whispered, looking away. I couldn't look into his eyes. I was afraid to see the same love I felt in them, and I was afraid to admit it. It's not love. It's a mistake. A terrible mistake that we've made. We have to end it. Now. I stood up and walked away. My legs felt like they were filled with lead, but I forced myself to keep walking, away from him, away from this forbidden love. He didn't try to stop me. He knew I was right, but he couldn't let me go. I walked fast, not making my way, tears streaming down my cheeks, hot rivulets burning my skin. I was in pain, so much pain. I felt broken, empty, lost. I didn't know what to do, where to go, how to move on with this heavy secret. Suddenly I heard a scream, his scream. I looked back. My father was running after me. He caught up to me, grabbed my arm. His fingers dug into my skin as if he was afraid I would disappear, vanish into the night air. "Alina, wait!" he shouted. His voice was hoarse, squeezed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I couldn't have imagined." "Let me go!" I shouted, wrenching my arm free. Anger and pain mixed inside me into a rattling cocktail. "I hate you. I hate you for what you did to me." I ran without looking back. I ran until I collapsed to the ground, exhausted. I lay on the grass, sobbing, and looked up at the stars, the cold, indifferent stars that had witnessed our love, our sinfulness. It seemed to me that the whole world had collapsed, that my life was over. I didn't know how to move on, how to forget what had happened, how to forget him, how to forget myself. That night, under the silent gaze of the stars, I made a decision that changed my life forever. I decided to leave my grandmother's house, this village, this country, to get away from him, forever, to save myself and him. Did you like the story? Write in the comments, what would you do in the heroine's place?